Chinetti knows, he can taste it, he can smell the victory if the car survives. One of the great racing history stories that I love is, of course, one of the ones that most people haven't heard about. Now, everybody's heard about the great Ferrari-Ford war in the 60s. That really ended up being, Ford winning with the GT40s and Ferrari never winning again at Le Mans. But in 1965, in the middle of all this, and it's usually the year that's glossed over in the histories, basically neither manufacturer won. In order to understand what was going on, you have to kind of go back a few years. In 1961, Ferrari had the Palace Uprising. And Enzo had a really horrific meeting with some of his biggest guys, like Bizzarini and Chidi, and they left Ferrari, basically gutted the organization. His head of racing, one of his designers, and all these guys left. And they formed a really strange little company called ATS, built a cute little car that never really did anything. But Ferrari's organization was really in peril. And in 1962 and 63, he luckily had some really great guys on the sideline like Scaglietti, and they came out with the amazing 250 GTO, which was all-conquering and one of the greatest cars of all time. In 1963, Ford came forward and they wanted to purchase Ferrari, which seemed to make a lot of sense because you'd buy Ferrari and you'd have an instant racing arm, you'd have an instant high-end automotive arm, and it was really appealing. And Henry Ford had a brand new Italian wife, so why not add an Italian company? And so they started negotiations, and the purchase price nowadays, it seems ridiculous. I heard it was like $16 million or something like that they were fiddling over. They sent over all these Ford accountants and Ford people, and Ford made a huge investment in it. They were really moving forward. It was going to happen. And at the last hour, at the last meeting, Enzo's sitting there with his famous purple pen that he had. He would just cross things out. They'd taken away what he actually wanted, which was he'd sell Ferrari. The street automobiles to him were never that important to begin with. He wanted control of the racing program with an unlimited budget so that he could go racing, which was the whole purpose of selling Ferrari. And they said no. And he just crossed it out, turned to his buddy, said, let's get something to eat. And they left, which hacked off Ford just a little bit. And by hacked off, I mean he turned his entire organization towards Ferrari to destroy them. The phone calls began almost immediately after that. We're going to go beat Ferrari where he lives, which is on the racetrack. And we're going to do it in the most famous race in the world, the 24 Hours of Le Mans. They brought 11 cars. They brought the 2 Mark II GT40s. They brought 4 Mark I GT40s. And they brought 5 of the Daytonas, of the 6 Cobra Daytonas. Ferrari, of course, responds by calling everybody they know to bring their Ferrari to the race. Now, they've got the 2 factory P2s. They brought over, there's all the Italian distributors around the world had their own little race team. So they would bring, there were a few of the 250 LMs, which some people call them 275 LMs, but because of the engine size. But Ferrari insisted it was called a 250 so that it have some lineage to the GTO. But according to the Ferrari engine size to number ratio, it should have been called a 275 because it's a 3.3 liter. But anyway, that's something else. They bought a few of those. They even had a 275 GTB, which was a street car, beautiful car, not a GTB. Total cheater car. Like really a GTO under the engine had been done, everything had been done. And Ferrari had lent their factory help to this privateer just to stack the deck. So there were 12 Ferraris versus 11 Fords line up at the beginning, which is pretty much almost half of the field at Le Mans. Race day comes, GT40's on pole. All the GT40s are up front, and it looks like it's going to be a bloodbath. The race starts, and off they shoot. And into the lead immediately goes, out of nowhere, a Maserati. And people are like, okay, that didn't last long. But it was kind of great that a Maserati fired out to the front. They had their moment in the sunshine. And for the first hour, it looked like a Ford show. It was also the first time that Wide World of Sports, the United States, did a live broadcast from Le Mans. And I guess the satellites failed, so all the Americans were watching was a black screen, and they could hear like Jim McKay's voice talking with people. But it sounded great. That was the hour that Ford wanted people to hear, because after that, it completely fell apart. And you could almost click off the hours going by with a GT40 dying. It was, for the 289s, it was warped heads. They had head bolt issues with all the 289s. Because Ford insisted on changing them before the race, and Shelby always thought, that was a mistake, and it was a mistake. And then the mighty Mark IIs, which already had heating issues, were pumping a tremendous amount of power through this tiny little transaxle. And even the engineers were like, it's not going to last. And it's good that they didn't last, because Goodyear was supplying the tires for the American effort. They brought over like 6,000 tires for all these Fords. The engineer who was in charge of it, right before everything started, was looking at the tires, and they were checking on the side after they got some heat into them, which wasn't unusual for those old tires. They had to make them really thick to make them work back then. He's looking at it, he's like, something's not right. And then he figured it out. They had used the molds for the Indianapolis tires to make these tires. So they weren't the right tires. They brought over a couple thousand of the wrong tires for this amazing Ford effort. And he thinks, oh, my job is over. And sure enough, the GT40s are out there. The first Mark II comes in for a fuel stop. It wasn't supposed to be a tire stop, and he's looking at the back. And Shelby, very famously, is always at the front of the car, pointing at everybody, making things happen. He's not looking at the back of the car. And the Goodyear engineer looking at the back, and he sees a bald tire on the back of this thing. And he's all like, you got to change the tires. You got to change the tires. And Shelby's like, no, don't change the tires. Like, no, you got to change the tires. They start changing the tires. He goes back, and he just sits in the trailer. He's like, what am I going to do? I've got thousands of the wrong tire. We've got Ford. My days are over at Goodyear, let alone the car industry. Remington, who was kind of helping run the program, comes over to him, and he's like, it's okay. It's all right. He's like, what do you mean it's okay? He's all, cars aren't going to last. Like, they knew it wasn't going to work out. And by midnight, all the GT40s are dead. And the good old Daytonas are still trucking out there. Dan Gurney's out there, all the great, they're tearing it up with those things. Meanwhile, Ferrari's like, see, in order to win a race, you have to finish a race. So they think they've got it in the bag, but they didn't. The factory P2s, the two factory P2s, had a new technology in them, which were ventilated front disc brakes, and they were cracking, and they didn't bring enough of them. So they were actually going out into the parking lot and grabbing people's cars and taking discs off of them. And the increased time it took to change all these brake discs were slowing them down, but they still had issues with the car. They had gearbox issues, and I think one had a head issue. Because it's a brutal race. It's absolutely brutal. It was very, very hot Le Mans that year. Shortly after all the Ford GTs are dead, the two Ferrari P2s are dead. And now nobody's got a car on the track that belongs to the factory. So Ferrari, quite smartly, is like, okay, what are we going to do? They move the factory banners over to the two 50 LMs that are running. One is running out to the lead, which is run by a Belgian team. Another one is run by Leo Cinetti's NART team from North America. That car is being driven by Maston Gregory and by Jochen Rindt, who would go on to become a posthumous Formula One champion. At the beginning, they were like the secondary team, in a secondary car. And Jochen Rindt was a real firebrand, and so was Gregory. I mean, Gregory was an American. They were like, okay, we'll do okay. And Gregory actually was slated to drive a Maserati, but that car had been destroyed in practice. So Cinetti's like, okay, you can drive my car. You're pretty fast. So they're driving that car, and Rindt is bored out of his skull because endurance racing is not Formula One racing. You can't go flat out for 24 hours. You can nowadays, but back then you had to manage the tires, you had to manage the gearbox, you had to manage the brakes, you had to make sure the car survived while staying at the front. He hated it. It's too much work. In the evening, that Saturday evening, he was like, okay, I'm done, I'm leaving. Starts packing his stuff up. Fortunately, he had parked his car first before the trucks came in, and he couldn't get his car out. So they found him trying to get the trucks moved so he could get his car out and just split. They came over and they were like, you got to run. He's like, if I'm going to race, I have to race my way. I'm going to race flat out. And if I don't do that, I don't race. And so Cinetti's like, we're here. We spent all the money. Fine, let's do it. You can just drive flat out. Gregory comes in. Rindt gets in, and Rindt starts cracking 5 seconds a lap faster than the other LM that's out there. And he's also going much faster than the Daytonas. And he's just crushing it, doing sideways half the time. But it's obvious that he's got the speed if the thing can survive. By about 3 o'clock in the morning, the lead cars were the American 250LM, the NART car. You had the Belgian 250, and we had the remaining Daytona and a mix of a couple other cars. Out front, in first place, is the Belgian 250LM. Coming up strongly is our hero, the NART car. The 250LM, I think, was in about third place at the time, and I think the Daytona was in second place. But it looked like, at taking 5 seconds off a lap, they were coming up strong. And it was possible at that point. So as the morning continued, they closed in, and it was now the Belgian car up front and the NART car in second place. Maston Gregory had glasses, thick glasses. And in the morning at Le Mans, it's foggy, traditionally foggy, and he couldn't see a damn thing. So he came in at daybreak, and they had the chance of winning. And this story came out many years later, that he came in and they couldn't find Rindt anywhere. He must have been, people slept wherever they could find some sleep. And they couldn't find him. Gregory couldn't drive. He couldn't see. And Ed Hughes was a backup driver. And he'd been helping out with the team and things like that. And Gregory just turns to him and goes, "Get your helmet. Just get it. We need to get back out there." So they put Ed in. Now, he's never officially been recognized as a driver. He didn't get up on the podium. And in fact, the story didn't come out until right about his death, around 2000 or so, if I remember that correctly. So he got in and drove while they found Rindt, and he came back in, a few laps later. Nobody's really quite sure on how many laps he did. Somebody said he did a full stint. He said he only did 6 or 7 laps, but he drove the car. Now, according to Le Mans rules, if you replace a driver, you have to stay in the car. That driver can't come back. So technically, Rindt could never have come back in the car. But he did. He hopped back in the car because Rindt was tremendously fast. So Rindt gets back in the car. Hughes kind of goes into the background, and Rindt starts ripping this thing apart. Like, really, everybody was nervous because it should not have held together. He is tearing this car to pieces to get to the front. Now, the only difference between his car and the Belgian car up front is that he's on Goodyear tires. And the front car, the Belgian car, is on the traditional Dunlops. And Dunlop, of course, sponsors Le Mans. There's the Dunlop tire that goes over the track. I mean, you can't miss it. Over the period of a couple of hours, he starts getting closer and closer and closer. But he's harming the car. And Ferrari is getting nervous because they've already lost their factory team cars. They don't want to lose the secondary team cars. They've already moved their flags over there. They're already looking like these are our best friends. This is the plan all along. We've got the 250LMs. Everything's fine. They approach Nard. They approach Chinetti, and they're like, "Slow down. We need to save these cars. They need to finish. We've obviously beaten the Ford. There's only one surviving Ford power car left. We don't have to worry too much about them. We need to finish the race." So they start making offers to Chinetti to make it, acceptable, maybe to back off. The story goes is that they offer him a couple of Ferrari street cars because he owned a distributorship in the United States that he could sell in the United States. Like, here's 2 Ferraris, you back off, everything's good, everybody's happy. And Chinetti's like, no. So they come back an hour later, like 4 Ferraris. 4 Ferraris, you, me, everything good. You have some Ferraris, you back off, they win, everyone's happy, good. And Chinetti's like, no. Chinetti knows, he can taste it, he can smell the victory if the car survives. Meanwhile, Gregory's back in, and he's beating the heck out of it. The odds of it finishing were slim at the beginning. And at this point, who knows? But they're closing in. Now they're only minutes behind the lead car. In a beautiful moment of racing irony, the Dunlop tire blows on the back of the Belgian car, ripping like a bunch of the rear sheet metal apart. And they have to bring it in, hammer out the sheet metal, get a new Dunlop tire on there. Meanwhile, the NART car takes the lead and is in front. And some stories have Ferrari going to them still after they had taken the lead and asking them to give back the lead to the Dunlop team. It comes out that all of this was at the request of Dunlop, not really Ferrari. Ferrari really wasn't as worried as they sounded about the car surviving. They didn't want a Goodyear, an American tire company, winning at Le Mans for the first time. They wanted Dunlop, the sponsor, out there winning. And so Dunlop was really behind these little machinations. God forbid an American tire company wins. Well, they won. The Goodyear tire survives, and they win the race. This little 250 LM is the last Ferrari ever to win at Le Mans overall. And still is to this day. They've never won overall since then. And you'd think it'd be one of the most prized possessions of Ferrari, but it gets forgotten. It goes on to race for a few more years. It never has the success it had at Le Mans, because Le Mans was really a fluke in reality. And it was never designed to be a front-running, all-winning car. And Ferrari never embraced it because it wasn't their car. It was almost a slight embarrassment that an American privateer had won for them when their own factory amazing P2s hadn't. So it gets donated to the Indianapolis Motorsport Museum, which is an amazing facility, but primarily is focused towards, obviously, Indy cars. And the little car gets stuffed down in the basement. And its partner stuffed in the basement in the corner, and literally almost jammed up against each other, is the 1979 Porsche 935 Le Mans winner, the Whittington brothers car. They're rammed up against each other with little signs in front that you would see at like a local car show telling what they are. And they lived in this kind of car purgatory in the basement of the Indy Museum, and most people wouldn't even see or even know what they were for years. And it wasn't until recently, when the Whittington brothers car was pulled out and got restored, and people were like, oh my God, this is a hidden gem, that Indianapolis realized, really what they had downstairs. So they took the 250 LM and they sent it to Canapa in Scotts Valley, where I was working at the time, to be brought back to life, to be taken to shows. So we get it in, and it's always amazing to be in the presence of something like that. I mean, granted, it's an inanimate object, it's a chunk of steel, but the history of it is sitting there. And it hasn't fired up in decades. We're given the job to get it ready to go, because it's got to drive across the lawn, and and when you win an award, you have to go up on the thing. It all has to work and look right. So we spent months researching what it looked like, exactly where, the straps that held the back end on, the right numbers, and found like the pieces were missing, like the fog lamps were missing. And to find fog lamps for a 1965 Ferrari is not the easiest thing, as you'd imagine. But we got all the right pieces for it, got it ready, and it had a kind of rough look to it. They wanted to keep it looking like it had just come off the racetrack, so it had a little bit of a rough front end look to it. And it looked like a little Warrior. It was a great little car. The day that it started, it was just like amazing, because there's 60 people who work in the shop, and they're all seasoned professionals, have seen everything. They've restored the first Duesenberg production car. They've done Can-Am cars. They've done everything, right? But when it time to start this, everybody stopped and turned like you were going to church. And it fired up. The little 3.3-liter V12 fired up, and it goes, rap! And you're like, oh my God. Like you've heard the gates of heaven open, right? And out of little flames and some smoke, and it comes to life, and it's just sitting there purring, making the greatest sound ever. And it's popping and making weird sounds because it's been sitting forever, right? But oh my God, to hear that motor that won Le Mans all those years ago working again was just tremendous. And we spent a few months getting it ready, and then it ended up going to Amelia Island. It went to the Quail. It won at the Quail. So it finally got the credit and glory it deserved. And in that time is when I did all my research on it, and we found out all the stories behind it, which were just phenomenal. And really, that's what a great car is the stories that are behind it. And this car has one of the greatest racing stories ever.
VINwiki wants to thank Auto Tempest for supporting our channel and making it easy for our viewers to find their dream cars. We love Auto Tempest because it allows you to compare the results from Craigslist nationally with all the top listing sites. So visit autotempest.com today and find your next dream car.